Welcome to the Power and Potential of Virtual Connection, a program presented on behalf of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center's virtual series. My name is Benouche, and I serve in a voluntary capacity as the Member for Communications and Outreach on the Ismaili Council for the Southeastern United States. The Ismaili Jamatkhana's around the world are more than places of worship and spiritual search. These spaces hope to encourage community engagement, to broaden our intellectual horizons, and foster an appreciation of pluralism. The world today is a global village, more interdependent than ever before, and the challenges of the 21st century demand solutions. The next generation will need to build skills and attitudes to collaboratively address these challenges. The need to know the other is ever more pressing. Welcome to the field of virtual exchange, defined as a sustained, technology-enabled education program that allows for cross-cultural communication and experiences for a greater number of young people with the ability to lead with empathy. Soliya has been doing just that. Their vision of a pluralistic world that embraces diversity and transforms conflicts into opportunities for collective learning and collaboration carries with it the urgency of now. They've worked with students from over 100 universities in 30 countries. They are the only US finalist for the 2019 Global Center for Pluralism Awards. The center, based in Ottawa, was founded by His Highness the Aga Khan in partnership with the Canadian government. The chair of the jury, the Right Honorable Joe Clark, who's also the former Prime Minister of Canada, describes the importance of the awards by saying, and I quote, "At a time of heightened hatred and escalating tensions in communities around the globe, these winners embody the best of humanity," unquote. I would now like to call or introduce you to our moderator, Albina Bimani. I'm also pleased to share with you that Albina is taking Soliya's fall training course titled Advanced Dialogue Training, which is a facilitation course endorsed by the UN Habitat.
Thank you, Benouche, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I have the honor of welcoming our speaker this evening, Ms. Waidehi Gokhale, who is the CEO of Soliya. In her role, she oversees the strategic development and fiscal well-being of the organization. With over 2 decades of experiences in the fields of psychology, peace building, and education, Waidehi is a leading advocate for virtual exchange. She has been engaged as a featured speaker by the U.S. Department of Education, the U.S. Institute for Peace, the Association of International Education, and the Aspen Ideas Festivals, elevating the reliably transformative power of meaningful inter- and cross-cultural dialogue when applied in higher education and beyond. She has given a number of interviews, including one with Forbes, and her recent interview is featured on the new Global Center for Pluralism portal, Pluralism and the Pandemic. Welcome, Waidehi.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Waidehi, before we turn to some questions, I would love to invite you to give us some brief comments about Soliya. Tell us the story. How did it begin? And what's the mission of Soliya?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So Soliya started as a collaboration project between 2 social entrepreneurs. One who was based in the field of conflict resolution and one who came more from a mainstream media background. Now, both these individuals had independent professional experiences in the Middle East and North Africa. And they had both come back to the United States, and they were genuinely concerned about what they viewed to be a challenging dynamic in the relationship between these two regions. And they met through a mutual friend and began to think about how they could affect change on this dynamic. And their feeling was, the best way to do this would be to ensure that many and many more people from the two regions have the chance to interact with each other in meaningful dialogue. But they were aware that in order to do that at scale, it's impossible to physically put people on planes. And at that time, so we're talking before social media, before Skype, before video conferencing, there was, an emergence of new media technologies, and they chose to think about that as a vehicle, as a route that they could potentially use to create the possibility that more and more people could be brought together. They then put a few stakes in the ground in terms of, the populations that they wanted to work with. They decided to work with post-high school age young people. And the reason for that was because they understood that it's quite a catalytic moment for identity crystallization. The idea that this is the first time you venture from home, you venture perhaps away from the narratives that surround you. You are enticed for the first time to explore your own biases and stereotypes and have them challenged perhaps. So they chose to work with that population. They enlisted an awful lot of advice and help from lots of different people. And they approached a technology company to help them build a platform. And so they put together the program and they created a technology that was designed to work in sync with their program outcomes. So they wanted to recreate the idea that young people could come together in small groups as if they were sitting around a table, and they could engage in difficult conversations, potentially, to have transformative exchanges. And they designed a facilitation training so that they could ensure that the conversations were safe and secure and guided. And they partnered with, in the beginning, institutions of higher education to bring in the students from the institutions. And that's how Soliya began. And so from there, we spent many years perfecting the model, doing this over and over again, thinking about what we wanted to achieve and how to measure it. And we are now in our 17th year of programming. And, this year, this calendar year, let's say, we estimate that we will reach something in the region of 6,500 young people globally and train 1,400 facilitators.
Wow, that is phenomenal. That is phenomenal. You spoke a little bit about technology in sync with your program outcomes, and I'm interested to see, how do you see interconnectivity as a solution to what's often been described as a fragmented world?
Yeah, so I think the question becomes, what do we consider that fragmentation to be? What is it that's happening? And I think that what we've seen is a rise in using fear as a tool to drive more insular thinking. And the trouble with that is it's very difficult to reverse the fortune of globalization. That's already happened. And so the reality of the world we live in is there's an entire generation of bicultural, biracial, bi-country, third culture young people who are growing up in countries of either not origin or host or chosen countries. And that means that whether we like it or not, if you combine that dynamic with the rise of technology, we are inherently interconnected. So what we need to foster is interconnectivity, which I think is different. So it's not enough to think of us as being linked. It's about what do we do with those linkages, right? We can't think along the lines of single state problems and single state issues. We have to grapple with the fact that what's happening in the world today is inherently going to be connected to somewhere else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what role do you think technology plays in this increasing interconnectivity?
So I think technology plays two roles. To begin with, it has made it so that the speed with which information gets shared, it seems like a redundant thing to say when we're talking about technology, but really the speed with which information can get shared has accelerated beyond anything I think we could have even expected, right? And so what it means is the breadth of the reach and ramifications of things that happen around the world is vast and expansive and difficult to control. So on the one hand, technology has created that sort of superhighway, right, of dissemination. And that brings with it a series of challenges. But on the other hand, if you can harness that potential of technology and use it in a deliberate and intentional way, then you can potentially overcome massive hurdles. So, for example, through our programs, we're able to bring together young people from geographies where arguably it would be impossible, if not very difficult, whether it's because of political, geographic, social, cultural, economic constraints that would stop these young people from having the opportunity to really engage with each other. You can be sitting in Syria, in Libya, on a farm in Kansas, you could be in Indonesia, in California, a village in France, and that group of people could come together and have voice and share their stories. That's not possible without technology.
Yeah. I love how you describe technology as a super highway of information. And that reminds me, in 2015, His Highness the Aga Khan delivered the Jodidi Lecture at Harvard University's Waidehi Center for International Affairs. And in it, he states, I quote, "We have more communication, but we also have more confrontation. Even as we exclaim about growing connectivity, we seem to experience greater disconnection," unquote. How do you reconcile that with Soliya's mission of greater connectivity leading to a greater understanding of the other?
Yeah, we often talk about this actually, and the way we think about it is, I think as new media technology exploded, the drivers behind tech companies kind of thought about it as long as we get people connected, then people will choose to connect. And I think that was fundamentally flawed. And we've shown that over and over again. Just because you are connected doesn't mean you are connecting. And they're very different, right? And so, and you only have to look so far as sort of how people engage on social media to understand the distinction. We all know that what often happens on social media channels is siloing and amplification of voices that are the same as yours, and things like that. We don't often seek out deliberate exchange across lines of difference. And thereby, I would argue, just being connected, as His Highness said, doesn't mean you're connecting. I think what we've learned is that one of the challenges with this, in terms of that whole information superhighway that I was talking about, is that there has become a greater burden on each of us around authorship and consumption of information, right? Anybody can author something and put it online, and it can be viewed by anybody anywhere, arguably. And so I think if you can commit to creating savvy consumers and savvy authors of that information. So if you can ensure that young people are coming to this information and thinking critically about it, and they're coming to this information and they're using a lens of understanding, they're using a lens of empathy. I think that's the key for us. If you can make it so that people start to use a lens of empathy as they engage with content and with information, then you make it possible for people to communicate more effectively. You make it possible for people to understand the value of that constructive engagement, right? And so for us, we believe that our method of connectivity is very intentional. We're not just presenting you with the possibility of connection. We're actually taking you through the practice of it, And so they're not, people in the programs that we run, they don't meet one-off. They don't meet asynchronously. The same group of young people will meet over a period of time. They'll meet under the guidance and the framework of a facilitated dialogue. And they're there to make a commitment to greater understanding, to deepen the engagement with one another, and inevitably to form relationships. And then what we find is they take this learning that they do when they're synchronously, face to face with each other in our exchange portal, in our video conferencing technology, and they use those skills to then become different citizens in their digital spaces. And then now that's when you've generated real connectivity.
Yeah. I think this idea of intentional connection and critical engagement, even in today's world, is so important. As you know, in the United States, these past few weeks has once again brought to the forefront the ugly face of racism and all of the negative forces associated with that. Do you see greater connectivity playing a role in such circumstances, and how so?
For sure I do, and I think that it's important to acknowledge that there's various different ways that connectivity works, So first of all, it's providing access. So the fact that we have access to things like video footage, coming out of moments that shed light on things that are going on, as well as going back to that speed and power. Unfortunately, it all happens really quickly, and there's no time for people to kind of take a breath and think about what they're looking at and think about what they're watching, in terms of the barrage of content and information. Now, that usage of technology and the speed by which you can disseminate, it could be to coalesce around something. So it could be to organize, or it can be used to disorganize, right? And so that in that way, technology remains sort of a double-edged sword. But again, if you can foster constructive connectivity. So if you can empower people to practice the art and science of dialogue and to think critically, right, at the same time about the information that they're grappling with, if you can get people to examine their own biases and stereotypes and commit to listening to and hearing the why of others who are different to themselves, who think differently to them, who look and live differently to them. So if we can do that, if we can proliferate that, then I think we can stand to make change happen. Am I saying dialogue alone can generate systemic and lasting change? But can it be a powerful driver for it? Very much so. And why? Because here's the thing. If systems today are deemed to be broken, then we have to think about who's going to now create the systems of tomorrow. Who's going to create the societal norms and frameworks that we want to see exist in the world? And that's the rising generation. And if we can get them to commit to the power of empathy, to the power of pluralism, to understand their responsibility and their ability to actually make these things happen, then I think technology and connectivity can play its part. You know, it just so happens that we at Soliya are getting ready to pilot our first ever domestic programming, whereby we'll bring together young people on a campus as part of their orientation to come together and facilitate a dialogue. And the idea is to foster dialogue across lines of difference with a view to creating more cohesive communities on campuses. And you know, it just so happens that we will now pilot this at this moment. The program was actually designed you know, the year before last, and we've been working our way to the pilot. So we'll be very interested now to see, you know, the translation of our work into the domestic context.
Absolutely. And you've spoken about the context and even the context of the pandemic that is happening around us. It has required many of us to embrace the use of technology. And we've talked a lot about virtual connection and exchange. But do you think that in-person connectivity may be better than virtual?
It's a tough question to ask me. I think that in-person connectivity is different to virtual connectivity. And I would hazard that people of my generation, how we view virtual connectivity is different to how the rising generations will view virtual connectivity. I think that virtual connectivity, when designed and implemented well, and I'll say that over and over again, right? Because you can do it well and you can do it not well. But when you do it with intention and you're clear about your outcomes, I think what we've learned is that you can foster what we call brave spaces. There's a way in which when these young people come together in this video conferencing platform, they find the means and method to be brave, to ask questions that they perhaps wouldn't ask each other if they were in person. They also learn to practice how to have these engagements, how to sit with difficult moments, how to listen well when hearing things that are hard to hear. And then they can take that and use it in their, you know, in their peer groups, at home, in their communities. The other thing we've learned through actually our neuroscientists who help us measure our impact, they're the ones who taught us that one of the things that's powerful about this methodology is that it allows for what they call spaced learning rather than massed learning, which means that every week the young people from the same group will come together. They'll wade in for 2 hours. They'll have this difficult conversation, potentially, or thought-provoking conversation, or, you know, and then they have a week now before they re-engage. And during that week, they digest and they percolate, and, you know, they get to sit with what happened and then come back and reopen that discussion or move to the next one. And what they taught us was, you know, it's like whether I stay up tonight and sort of cram everything in my head and take a test tomorrow. Will I do okay? Probably. But if you ask me all the questions again a week from now, it'll probably all be gone because of how I did it in a massed way, right? Whereas if you do learning in a spaced way, then what we learn is, you know, people, the learning stays with them for longer. And that, you know, so we can but hope.
Yeah. And I think you've got us started on talking about some of the skills that the students are acquiring, such as sitting with difficult moments, listening well. And I know that Soliya has had a research partnership with the Sachs Lab Social Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory at MIT that you mentioned, with the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. The focus of that research is to identify evaluation tools to measure attitude changes and skill development that young people achieve through Soliya's Connect program. Can you briefly share some results of the research to show our audience the impact of Soliya's work and maybe share a success story or two?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So yes, we were picked up sort of like by as a bit of a pet project by some incredible cognitive neuroscientists who were really interested in the idea of and this was, we're talking 12 years ago, so it was a while back now, and they were really interested in the idea of whether you could affect change on how groups feel about one another, in the same way that, basically they were interested to know whether classical contact theory would translate into virtual spaces. So if I meet you through a program like this, will it alter my ability to think of you through a lens of empathy? Will I understand our identities as overlapping? Will I be less likely to dehumanize and generalize and stereotype, all that kind of thing, those who I consider other from me? And so they thought that this program was a great way for them to learn whether or not that was possible. And so they've spent an awful lot of time with us, helping us build those tools to measure those things. And the big question was, how on earth do you measure change in empathy, right? And so we do pre and post tests, and what the tools that they've built out are little games and questions that are embedded into our survey mechanisms, that speak to these three sort of elements. One is feeling a sense of respect and warmth, both towards and in receipt of, from groups that are other to your group. So that's one. The other one is understanding or thinking about how much my identity overlaps with that of a group that is other to mine. And then the other one is humanization, how easily I dehumanize another group. And so together, those three to us give you a fairly good sense of, have I moved from a place of having or not having a lens of empathy through which to view your group, right? So those are the kinds of tools they've been using. And so what we do is we do pre-program and post-program measurement. And then the other thing they have us do is control groups. So we also do survey participation from young people who are, at the same university, taking the same class, but some of them are doing the Connect program and some of them are not. And in fact, just today, ironically, we got some preliminary data that shows that the statistical significance of change is really notable. So I'm excited to dig into that data a little bit more. And so there's that element of it, which is sort of the measurable change, through using these tools. And then there's the anecdotal stuff. We were able to do some control group runs at the time of the Boston Marathon bombings, and we were able to test change in both the participants and the control group data set with time lapse. So we were able to do it pre-program, post-program, and then a number of months out and a number of months out again. And the distinction, between how the participants viewed other groups, particularly in relation to Islamophobia, dehumanization, and identity overlap, not only was there clear change pre and post participation, but then the data set sort of diverged further like this, the further out you went. So the learning continued for participants. They held even harder to the concepts of change and learning that they'd gained, and the control groups veered off. And so that was very illustrative for us, right? We have another story of our programs running during the revolution in Egypt, and us very much assuming that participation from certain universities would be impossible at that point, because they were contending with unrest and the security situation had deteriorated. There were rolling blackouts. We didn't know if they'd even have access. And one of the professors from one of the institutions was insistent. He said, no, I'm sure that my students really want to still be meeting with their global peers so they can share this moment, straight from the horse's mouth, if you like. And so they figured out a way to use an internet cafe that was nearby, but the security situation wasn't great. So the professor described that the male students committed to standing guard outside of the cafe to ensure that their peers, their female counterparts, could participate, because they were so keen to ensure that they could stay the course with the program. So I think we've learned that the experience is unique. The experience is powerful in sort of a way that's hard to understand. You know, there are still people who will question, but how can you get to this depth using technology? And it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary, the bonds that get built. And then just one last example I'll give you is recent. So we were ready to launch the Connect program on the 16th of March, which this year was just as the world was locking down. You know, we weren't sure, how would this work? Would people be able to engage? And we had almost 4,000 young people connect right through, you know, March and April. And the feedback from that is, you know, very profound, because this was a moment when you had young people from anywhere to anywhere geographically who were having to isolate, and you know, that had some interruption or disruption to normal life, and there was so much media information. You know, the information superhighway was exploding, and the amount of feedback that we got from participants, from facilitators, from partner professors, youth groups, who said the profound importance of having the capacity to engage with one another, to tell their stories the way they wanted them to be told, not reading them on, you know, on news channels, but really just connecting to one another's stories, to be able to share the differences, the similarities, and then to go from there and to start thinking about their responsibility and what next. What, you know, what can we do to change how the world tackled this? It was really, really amazing to see.
That's phenomenal. I think after hearing your stories and experiences, no wonder that Soliya came to be chosen as one of the finalists for the Global Center for Pluralism. Would you like to tell us how that came to be and what your experiences were like winning the award?
Oh, absolutely. So this was very extraordinary. We were deeply, deeply honored. Actually a partner professor in Canada who had taken the Connect program to her classroom became very interested in the work. I believe she then went on to train as a facilitator. And she's the person who nominated us. And so we had no idea, and we were just thrilled and excited when we started going through the process. And the center's process was, you know, remarkable. They spent so much time getting information, talking to our networks, talking to us, understanding the work as their process of assessment. And so then to be in the top 10 was just very humbling for us. You know, the people who we were mentioned with do extraordinary work, and then to be brought to Ottawa and taken into the ceremony and have the chance to spend time at the center, and the very deep honor of meeting His Highness and the Princess, and really being given a platform to talk about this work and to recognize its alignment with a commitment to pluralism was really very, very important to us as an organization. We were very, very grateful.
That's wonderful. Well, this is my final question to you. In 2014, His Highness the Aga Khan delivered the Ogden Lecture at Brown University, and in it he says, I quote, "Greater connectivity does not necessarily mean greater connection," unquote. What might you recommend to individuals who are looking to foster greater connectivity through virtual platforms so that they can achieve greater connections?
I think it's a really important question, and I think His Highness's statement is exactly what we've been talking about today, right? The idea that just because you're connected doesn't mean you're connecting, and I think that the most important thing is to invest in platforms that allow the kind of deliberate connection that we want to foster. You know, one of the things that I think can't be stated strongly enough is what we've learned is you can affect change on empathy, and to us, empathy is it's not a soft skill. It's a hard skill. It's actually a commitment. It's, you know, a way of life, and you very deliberately sign up for it. And if you can create platforms that allow the fostering of that hard skill, and you end up with a whole generation of people who commits that they will, you know, look at decision making through a lens of empathy, they will make choices through a lens of empathy, then I think you know, come to a place where you proliferate this and you create change, you know. And I think that the Connect program has taught us this for sure over and over again. And I think that if you look at what's happened in the world right now, if you look at the kind of leadership that has risen in the face of crisis, the kind of leadership that has taken countries through this transformative moment that the world has been going through, and done it with some semblance of success, or some semblance of progress, I think you'll identify that there are certain leadership qualities that include collaboration, that include engaging with one another constructively, that include that lens of empathy. And so I think that if we can find a way to make this happen for more and more young people, then that'd be a win.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Waidehi, for spending the time to speak to us today and for sharing the amazing work that Soliya is doing to cultivate a more pluralistic world. I would also like to thank the Ismaili Council for the Southeast for empowering the next generation to learn about building skills and attitudes to collaboratively address challenges of the 21st century and learn to lead with empathy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Waidehi and Albina. I hope to the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this session as much as I have. We are living in some challenging times, never ever experienced by this generation. While we hope things get better, and yes, hope we must have, the world as we know will change too. While uncertainty remains, we can use this time to build our skills and attitudes, and hope to be able to learn from one another, to listen to one another and appreciate the other perspective, and also lead with empathy. And together, I truly believe that we can improve the quality of life for generations to come. On behalf of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Centers, thank you for joining.